this evening's public lecture. The public lecture series that's organized by the Institute for Mathematical Sciences is generously funded by the Encoding Memorial Fund. This evening's lecture is to be given by Professor James Davis of the University of Richmond. Professor Davis studied at the University of Virginia and joined the University of Richmond in 1988 and has been there ever since. But before that, he actually worked for 2 years at Hewlett Packard and has, under his name, 15 patents filed for his inventions. He works, his research interest is in the area of combinatorics and also in the area of error correcting codes. Professor Davis has also served as an expert witness for the Samsung battle that took place a few years ago, and I believe that tonight he will tell us something about his experience. So tonight he will speak on the title called Apple and Samsung, a Mathematical Battle. Please welcome Professor Davis.
Okay. I assume that everyone in the room has heard of Apple and has heard of Samsung. I also assume that most of you are aware that Apple and Samsung have been fighting a war, a patent war, all around the world. What you may not be aware of is the central role that mathematics plays in at least part of that war. That's my job tonight. I want to describe to you the mathematics of one of the patents that was in dispute between these two companies. Now, full disclosure up front, I served as a testifying expert for Apple. So for those of you that are Samsung fans, you might be a little disappointed in some of the things that I say, but I will try to give a balanced idea of what the issues were technically, mathematically, legally, and even politically, as we'll see. So, interesting story. And in particular, what I want to describe is how I, as a mathematician, found myself in the middle of this dispute. So, just to give a sense of the size of the clash of these two, I don't know what the current valuation is for either Apple or Samsung, but this is several years ago. Apple was supposedly worth more than $1 trillion. And Samsung is not a small company either, almost $200 billion. So these are enormous companies that compete in the same market space. They sell cell phones, they sell tablets, and the thing that we're going to focus on is the fact that all of these devices that have come over the last 15 years or so communicate wirelessly. So they don't have to be plugged into a wall or into an Ethernet cable in order to transmit from one device to the other. They can do it through the air. And there's a lot of technology that's required in order to make that work. That's where our dispute is going to focus, okay, is on that wireless communication of the devices that all of you, I'm sure, have in your pockets right now. So here is an article that appeared in the New Yorker. Some of you may be familiar with the New Yorker. It's mostly thought of as a literary magazine, but they do have news stories. And on August 6th, 2013, there was an article titled, Obama, okay, that's President Obama's Apple Rescue. And here's the first paragraph of that article. In June, the U.S. International Trade Commission, let me just stop right there. So the lawsuit that I'm going to describe was fought in a court called the International Trade Commission. This is just one of the possible places where you can have it. The advantage and the reason why it was tried there is from the moment the lawsuit was filed to the completion of the trial was less than a year, which is extremely fast in terms of lawsuits. And Samsung was suing Apple, and they wanted to get an answer as quickly as they could. So the U.S. International Trade Commission is where they took it. And the U.S. ITC banned the import of older iPhones and iPads. Pause a moment there. If you know anything about how the manufacturing is done for iPhones and iPads, they're all manufactured outside the United States. None of those are manufactured in the U.S. So if this ruling were left to stand, there would be a wall at the borders, okay, to take a current political phrase, and there would not be allowed any iPhones or iPads in. Now, if you think about that, that's a pretty big step and a pretty big penalty against Apple. There are a few things that qualify that. It is older iPhones and iPads, so the newer ones would have been allowed in. Apple had anticipated that this was going to happen, so they built up their inventory in the United States, so it wasn't really going to affect, but it was still, a pretty big ruling when it happened. Okay, ruling that the devices infringed on one of Samsung's most basic patents. I don't know exactly what the journalist meant by most basic patents, but that's the phrase they used. That's the patent that we're going to be talking about tonight regarding the way cell phones connect to a network. On Friday, so this was written in August of 2013, however, the Obama administration came to Apple's rescue and vetoed the ban. So this is an unusual court in the United States where the president gets the final word. And the president, Obama, vetoed this ban, which is the first time in 35 years that any president had actually stepped into the ITC process. So it was a big deal that the president stepped into this. There's a parenthetical remark here. Samsung was the disappointed party 35 years before that too. I don't know what that one was about. And then the final sentence of that first paragraph, Obama did not simply bail out America's homegrown high-tech champion. He showed how he plans to use the Oval Office to reform the U.S. patent system, one of the promised centerpieces of his technology policy. So the patent that we're going to talk about tonight is at the center not only of this legal battle between Apple and Samsung, but it's in the middle of this political fight in the U.S., and I'll describe a little bit about what it was that got Obama interested in this particular patent. So, back to Apple and Samsung. By July 2012, they were involved in 50 lawsuits all over the world. I have some of the places where those were occurring. Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, that's all in Europe. In Asia, South Korea, which is Samsung's backyard, there was a lawsuit there. California is the one that made a lot of the press. So that it was right close to Cupertino, which is Apple's headquarters. Australia. And what you'll notice is that I actually have 2 copies of Washington, D.C. That's not a misprint or a mistake on my part. The trial that I was involved with took place in Washington, D.C., and at the exact same time that my trial was taking place, the courtroom right next door was also Apple and Samsung. In my case, it was Samsung suing Apple. In the courtroom next door, it was the other way. It was Apple suing Samsung. The Samsung lawyers were the same for the 2 trials. So they were running back and forth between the 2 courtrooms, which was really rather amusing to watch that take place. So anyway, that's where these things, but again, this is all part of a much larger war that was going on. Many of those are different than what we're going to be talking about tonight. In particular, the California one that got all the press was about the look and feel of the devices. So if you put the iPhone on the table and the Samsung Galaxy of that time, it would be hard for a consumer to distinguish between those two. They looked very much the same. Apple had a lot of patents on this look and feel, so this is sort of the externals, and they claimed that Samsung infringed, and the court agreed with them and awarded Apple $1 billion. That's why it got so much press. We're not talking about look and feel. We're looking at the internal workings of these phones, and in particular this wireless communication. And you know, again, many of you in this room aren't old enough to remember the time before you had these wireless devices, but it's just extraordinary that we're able to send text messages, we can talk on our phones, we can stream video back and forth. Okay, that's a lot of data that's going to be transmitted, and it's a lot of different types of data. So one of the things that's internal to all of these devices, anything that can communicate on the 3G network, is something called TFCI information. This is Transport Format Combination Indicator. You don't need to know what that means, but it's a way that the cell phone communicates to the base station what is coming next. Okay, is this going to be a text message, which is very low amount of data, that's the tortoise, it can come very slowly and it doesn't really matter? Or is this going to be streaming video? Or is this going to be something in between? The base station really needs to know what the next thing is that's coming is, so that it can process it and forward it on to the next place that it's going to go. If you get TFCI wrong, then everything gets garbled. And you know, we've all had that experience where things don't work the way you want it to, but TFCI is really that initial handshake or way of communicating between your device and the base station. Okay, so if it's that important to get right, what do the engineers do to ensure that you get it right? Well, what the engineers did, and here just a little bit of history, you have what's called a standards process. Okay, and again, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but some of you will remember the video recorders that came out in the 80s. There were two different types and they were incompatible with each other. That's a disaster as far as consumers are concerned, because you might buy the wrong one and then you've just wasted a whole lot of money. The way the technology companies get around that is they all come together, even though they're competitors, but they say, hey, I want to make sure that my iPhone can talk to your Galaxy, okay, or your Nokia, or your whichever phone you happen to have. We want to make sure that they can communicate with each other. And this TFCI information was going to be part of it, so let's agree on what that TFCI information is going to be. This is in 1998 when 3G was being designed, and they said, let's just take something that we know works. And the code, which is just a way of ensuring that you can get the communication correct, that they picked, was exactly the same code that was used in 1971 to transmit pictures like this back from Mars. Now this picture is roughly 3.5 megabytes. Okay, so your phones all have much higher resolution than this, but in the 1970s, 3.5 megabytes was an insane amount of data. Okay, that's as high a resolution as they could possibly even imagine doing, and so you get a 3.5 megabyte picture that's transmitted 100 million miles back from Mars. Think about the difficulty in doing that, and the likelihood that as you transmit this picture, which is just going to come back in zeros and ones, what's the likelihood of having mistakes in those zeros and ones? It's really likely. So you want to build in this capability of correcting errors on the fly, because you don't want to, every time a mistake happens, just send a signal back to the Mariner 9 and say, hey, something went wrong, send us something else, you know, retransmit, because you'd be doing that all the time and you'd never get your pictures. You have to build in some duplication. So here's where we have to get into a little bit of the math, and describe what it was that the Mariner 9 used. The Mariner 9 used something called a first-order Reed-Muller code. Okay, so you see at the top, RM, that stands for Reed-Muller. That's just a name. You don't have to worry about that. They're the people that put this code together. The 1 stands for first order. That's just a type of Reed-Muller code, and we will see second order a little bit later. The 5 on the end is the really important one for us to focus on for now. That 5 determines how long the strings of zeros and ones are going to be. So the length of those, in other words, the number of bits that a code word is going to consist of, and that's how you're going to transmit the pictures back, is going to be 2 to the 5th. So when you look horizontally across, so if you look at the red string of zeros and ones, it's difficult to count, but if you did, there would be 32 ones in that all one sequence. Then when you go down 1 to the next, the first blue one, it's alternating zeros and ones, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. There are 32 there. The next one down, 2 zeros, 2 ones, 2 zeros, 2 ones, and all the way down to the bottom one has 16 zeros and 16 ones. Those are a start for describing the first order Reed-Muller code, but if that was the end of the story, then we'd only be able to transmit 6 different shades of gray. Okay? And we want to have a better, maybe there's something really interesting on Mars, and 6 different shades of gray is not going to do it. Well, it turns out that you can take any combination of these. So just to have an example, and this is what's called the encoding process. This is how the Mariner 9 encoded its information. This is also how TFCI was going to encode the information. It's exactly the same process. Let's say you have an input stream that's 010010. That's going to be a shade of gray, or that's going to tell you that streaming video is coming later. Whatever interpretation is appropriate for the application you're looking at, how does that get encoded into a string of zeros and ones? Well, you just take those 32 length code words from the previous slide, and you do a combination of those. So we're going to do 0 times the all one code word, plus 1 times V1, plus 0 times V2, and you're just using each of those bits of information coming in to tell you whether you're going to add one of those streams of zeros or ones or not. And in particular, in this one, I put a box around the ones that have 1, so we're going to add V1 plus V4. That's what that input stream would do. Well, what do I mean by add? Okay, it seems like a simple question, but I need to talk about what am I referring to when I say add. Here's what V1 plus V4 looks like. V1 was that alternating zeros and ones. Okay, so it was in blue on the previous line, but it was 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1 to length 32. The V4 is 8 zeros, 8 ones, 8 zeros, 8 ones, and I put them on top of each other because I'm going to just add component by component. So whichever things are lined up, I'm going to add. And the only thing that's tricky about this, and it happens a few times here, is that occasionally you get a 1 being added to a 1, and you see that that comes out to be a 0. That's how you add in binary. Okay? And if you just follow that rule, that's a very simple thing to build into your hardware. It's called an XOR gate, for those of you that know what that is. This is the way that you can encode, and what that does is that enables you to take any input stream of 6 bits and have a string of length 32 coming out. That's the encoding side. So for TFCI, that's what you would do. Now, the much harder problem mathematically is the correction side. Okay, so let me simplify things a little bit on the correction side to give you the idea of how correction works. Let's suppose that you had a very primitive camera, and for each pixel, it was either going to be on or off, black or white. Okay? Black, I'm going to represent with a 1, and I'm going to transmit, instead of just transmitting a 1, I'm going to transmit 8 ones. So if I have my Mars mission transmitting back 8 ones, that means that that pixel is black. If it transmits 8 zeros, that means that pixel is white. Okay, so we only have 2 possibilities here. Again, this is very simplified to get the idea of this correction idea. Now, you transmit over 100 million miles, and what you receive looks like this in red. 110, 11110. Now, you automatically know that's not one of our legitimate messages. So something went wrong. You don't know exactly what, but now we have to make some deductions here. We're not going to ask for a retransmission because that's just too costly to us. So we say, well, which do I think is more likely? And the way that I determine that is I measure the distance from that received word to each of the possibilities. And I'm using the word distance here. I put it in quotes because distance is not measured like 5 inches or 8 meters, but it's measuring how many of the bits are different between those two. And I claim that the distance that I have up on the screen is 2 because there's 2 places that have different values. Whereas, if I compare it to the other possibility, that distance is 6. And so if I have to make a decision here, which I do, I'm going to say it's more likely that it was the all ones than it was the all zeros because there's less things to change. The point of this is to give you the idea that if we can design our code so that the distances between those allowable messages is big, then we'll be able to correct a lot of errors. That's what the first order Reed-Muller code is terrific at. Okay? So this is not the entire first order Reed-Muller code, but this is just a small part of it. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that no matter what code words I picked, okay, I've picked V1 and V1 plus V3, we have all these different possibilities. I claim that the distances between those code words is either 16 or 32. They're very far apart. So if I have a received word that's 2 away from one of my code words, it's going to be at least 14 away from everything else, and so I know what to do in my decoding. Okay, and that's why the first order Reed-Muller code was used for the Mariner 9 mission, and that's why that was the initial proposal for TFCI. But here's the issue. Okay, here's the problem with going with that, is this is supposed to be a grayscaling here. You only have the possibility of having 64 different shades of gray. What if you want to send color pictures? What if you want to send much more finely gradated on the grayscaling than 64? The first order Reed-Muller code of length 32 is not going to be the appropriate code for you. It's terrific at error correcting. It just doesn't allow you to send very many messages. And on the TFCI side, it doesn't allow you to have a wide range of messages you can send to the base station to tell what's coming next. So the 3G community, the standards body that was working on this, gets together, they scratch their heads, they say, what are we going to do about this? Okay? And Nokia, okay, one of the technology companies that was involved, made a proposal that instead of only having 6 input bits, they would have a code that would have 10 input bits. Okay? So that doesn't seem necessarily like it's a huge improvement, but what that allows, instead of only having 2 to the 6th possible messages, you now have 2 to the 10th, which is 1,000. So you've gone from 64 to 1,000 by having more input bits. But how did they do it? And what we're going to describe now is not exactly how Nokia did it, but it's close enough for what we're talking about tonight. So we start with, and what Nokia did is they started with the same code that was originally proposed. First order Reed-Muller is a great code. Let's have that as part of what we're going to do. And let's blow it up to the second order Reed-Muller code. So you still have the all one red one at the top, and the red is just to identify it. Then you have the blue alternating zeros and ones and all the ones that we've had before. But you have these green vectors down in the bottom. Length is still 32. And the way that you get that top green one is you just multiply the two rows above it together in every component. That's how you get a second order Reed-Muller. We don't need to go into details on that, but that's a way to describe the second order Reed-Muller code. And you could just take 4 of the green rows and use that as your new code. But here's the problem with the Nokia code and the one that we have up here. Look at the distance between the bottom blue row and the top green row. So remember, distance is asking the question, how many positions are different? Okay? Well, you go along, there's a whole string of zeros. Those, you don't count any distance. Then you have some blue ones that are on top of green zeros. But there's only 8 of those. And then it ends with all ones. The distance between those is 8. So when you move, if you're not careful about the way that you do this, when you move from the first order Reed-Muller to the second order Reed-Muller, your distance apart shrinks from 16 down to 8. And that affects the ability to correct errors. Instead of being able to correct 7 errors no matter where they are, now you can only correct 3. Well, that might not be good enough for us. You might want to do much, much better than that. So this is what I call the Goldilocks problem. Okay? I don't know if this is a familiar fairy tale in this part of the world. My wife and I are going to go see Ha Par, which apparently has fairy tales, Singaporean fairy tales. Goldilocks and the 3 bears. So the picture there, Goldilocks goes walking through the woods. She comes across a house. She goes in even though she shouldn't. I think that's part of the lesson. I'm not actually quite sure what the moral of the story is supposed to be for Goldilocks. But anyway, she sees 3 bowls of porridge. One's too hot, one's too cold, one's just right. And then there are 3 chairs. One's too small, one's too big, one's just right. And I think she breaks one of the chairs in a lot of stories. And then there are 3 beds. One's too small, one's too big, or too hard, or too soft, or whatever it is. But in each case, one is just right. Kind of in the middle of those. What we're looking for in encoding theory is something between first order and second order. One of them is too small, the other one's too big. We want something that's just right that falls in between them. So this is what the 3G community was thinking about at the time, and what they should have realized, and what any mathematician would realize, is they weren't the first people that were thinking about that very issue. In fact, this is chapter 15 of McWilliams and Sloan that was published in the late 1970s. 20 plus years before the 3G community was getting together. They have a whole chapter on the Goldilocks problem. They didn't call it that. But what do you do if you want something between first order and second order Reed-Muller? You look for Curdock, Preparata, and similar types of codes. And they had a whole chapter devoted to exactly that problem. Now somehow, Samsung claimed that they did something incredibly novel. This is where I start to make some comments about Samsung that some of you might, if you're a Samsung fan, not appreciate that much. But Samsung got a patent, not only in the United States, but in a lot of other countries around the world, Europe and Australia and a lot of other places, for finding this Goldilocks code that was described at least 20 years before that in a textbook. It wasn't even in a research paper, it was in a textbook. So it already was something that people knew generally. This is called the 348 patent. I'll refer to it that way in the future. It's actually patent 7,706,348, but people get tired of saying all that, so they call it the 348 patent. And there it is. Okay? And we'll talk much more about that in a little bit. But here's a question you might be thinking about at this point. What does this have to do with Jim Davis? Okay? Jim Davis was a testifying expert in this battle between Apple and Samsung. How did I get in the middle of this description? And in order to tell that story, I need to talk for a minute. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I did some work at Hewlett-Packard. And in particular, I was working at Hewlett-Packard in the academic year 95-96. So the importance of that is that was just before the 3G community was coming together. And I was working on a system called OFDM, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. For those that care, it's not that important if you don't know what that means. But roughly speaking, what that was doing was wireless communication. And it was doing wireless by asking this question. We could transmit 1 bit at a time, but that seems very slow. What we'd like to do is transmit a whole bunch of information simultaneously. But we can't do that on the same frequency. So what if we transmitted a whole bunch of bits, each on their own frequency, and then you would add those, each one of those would be some cosine wave, and then you add those cosine waves together. And you get this really crazy, wiggly looking transmission, but then you transmit that, and there's easy ways for the engineers to pull that apart and figure out what was the original message. Great idea, okay? But what the engineers worried about with that is, okay, for those of you that know cosine waves, the peaks of those could line up, even though they're different frequencies. And if you get all those peaks lining up, you could get this gigantic spike that would be a real problem for transmission. And in particular, it would cause you to have to crank the power up in order to transmit that signal, and it would drain your battery. And batteries are still an issue, but 20 years ago, people really cared about batteries, and so the engineers really didn't know what to do about this power control problem. Jonathan Jedwab and I were working at Hewlett-Packard with the engineers, and what we did, and it was mentioned that I had some patents, here's one of my patents that had to do with the solution to the power control problem having to do with Reed-Muller codes. Okay, those same codes that we were talking about in the Mariner 9 mission and in TFCI somehow are, and it is still a little mysterious why they're in the middle of this, but they're the perfect solutions. Second order Reed-Muller codes, first order Reed-Muller codes, all plays a role in controlling the power, and Jonathan and I have a patent on that. What the lawyers from Apple, so here's the sequence of events. Samsung has a lawsuit. They sue Apple for infringing on that 348 patent. Apple calls up their lawyers and said, help, help, you know, we're getting sued here. We need some help on this. And the lawyers say, okay, well, let's start reading it. Reed-Muller codes. They have no idea what Reed-Muller codes are at all. And so they just go through patents in the mid-1990s that had to do with wireless communication and Reed-Muller codes. They stumble across this patent. And they call me up, completely out of the blue. I had no idea what this was, but I get this call from lawyers from Apple saying, so there's this thing called TFCI information, which I had no idea what that was, never heard of that, but they're using second order Reed-Muller codes to encode this. What do you know about that? Second order Reed-Muller codes. That I know something about, and I can help you with that. And in fact, when they went on to describe it, I said, I know that this code, what they're claiming is really novel and innovative and deserving of a patent. I can do it, you know, in less than an hour. And they said, you do that and call us back. So we hung up the phone, and I went to, what did I do? I went to my bookshelf. There's McWilliams and Sloan. That's that book that I was telling you. I cracked it open. I hadn't looked at Reed-Muller codes in probably 15 years. Okay? I mean, I'd worked on it a while back, so it took me a little while to find the appropriate page and all that. But in under an hour, I had produced the code. by hand. I didn't use a computer, I just wrote it out, in a little while, zeros and ones, all 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, It just took a little while to figure that out, but under an hour, and they're getting a patent for doing that, somehow. So I called them back and I said, listen, this is ridiculous that they got a patent. I'd be happy to say that in court. Okay, they said, okay, maybe we'll have you do that. Well, where did I go? And so here's a little bit more of the math. Okay, and this is for the mathematicians in the room. Theorem 5 in chapter 15 talks about it. And for the non-mathematicians, you can see there in the middle, here's R of 1m. I called it RM for Reed-Muller, but that's the book's notation for Reed-Muller. That's script R 1m. So that's just first order Reed-Muller codes. And then the R, script R 2m right there is second order Reed-Muller. Same thing we were talking about. Okay? And it just gives you a recipe for picking the right code words to do what you want. And then you just have to turn the handle and figure out how to apply that recipe. If I'd really been on my game, so if it'd been 15 years, I hadn't looked at this stuff for a while, I would have flipped over to page 455. And I know this because I had to say this a million times in court. Corollary 17. Okay? Corollary 17 has the code explicitly written out. Okay? Now, how is that explicitly written out? What's that have to do with the 348 code? So here, at the top, you have this m, which is 2t plus 1. So it's an odd number. I want m to be 5. And when I come down to this list of parameters of the code that you get, the first parameter on that list, the 2 to the m, is the length. How many zeros and ones do you have? It's length 2 to the 5th is 32. That's what we're looking for. The second parameter, when you fill it in, is how many input bits are you allowed to use? It comes out to 11. So it's even better than the Samsung code. They could only do 10. This one does 11. That's better. Okay, it's always better to have more input. And the minimum distance here, when you work that out, is 12. That's what the Samsung code minimum distance was. And that's what controls your error correcting capability. Now, just a funny side note, at least to me, this, again, I know this is page 455. I could even, in my mind, picture where it is on the page. I so memorized this, this result. Here's what my conversation with the Samsung lawyers was like in the courtroom. So, Dr. Davis, turn to page 455. So I turned to page 455, even though I didn't really need to because I had that page memorized. But where on page 455 does it say length 32? Samsung lawyers asked me the question. Well, when you look at corollary 17 and you plug in t equals 2, you get m equals 5, and that gets you length 32. Oh, you had to plug something in. That must have taken a clever step, or, who would have thought of that? I don't see that as the, and I said, well, this is just how mathematicians talk to each other. They, they do the gross general result, and then you just know that that's what you plug in. Oh, but, somebody had to figure out what you had to plug, and again, it was back and forth. And of course, Samsung is not going to just give it to me and say, oh yeah, I guess we're wrong, and sorry we wasted everybody's time. They were going to fight it, but it was that level of fighting that it came down to is, boy, that must have been really clever to think of plugging in t equals 2. Okay, well, what I'm saying here is that I think that the judge at the ITC should have invalidated the patent. Invalid means that the patent should not have been granted. The U.S. Patent Office, or wherever you are, made a mistake in granting the patent. Okay? Now there are two ways legally, so this is getting a little into the legal, but you can sort of imagine how this goes. Two ways that you can invalidate a patent. One is anticipatory. And there, I would have to make an argument that one reference, and I would say McWilliams and Sloan is the reference, but one reference that existed at the time of the invention contained all of the claims that were in the claim that we're going to look at in just a second. So that's one way. The second way is what's called obviousness. So maybe it's not just in one place, but to a person of ordinary skill in the art at the time of the invention, this would be something that they would have just done. Now the lawyers get involved again. Okay? What is a person of ordinary skill in the art at the time of the invention? So we had to have an argument about that before the trial. I said that in the late 1990s, a person of ordinary skill in the art was somebody that had graduate training in coding theory. Okay, because there were plenty of people around that had graduate training in coding theory. Samsung proposed that a person of ordinary skill in the art was somebody who had had 2 years of experience in the telecoms world. Okay, so their bar was much lower. The person didn't have to know anything about coding theory, and so maybe somebody that had 2 years of telecoms experience might look at this code and say, "Whoa, that's really clever," Whereas somebody with graduate training in coding theory would say, just pull McWilliams and Sloan off the shelf. Well, anyway, the judge ruled before the trial that Samsung's definition was the one that we had to use. So, in all the arguments that I made that tried to invalidate this patent, based on an obviousness argument, I had to convince the judge that a person with 2 years of experience in telecoms would find this an obvious thing. Okay? Now, I do want to, this is just, I think, fun to have a sense of what a patent claim looks like. This is the main one that was in dispute. Claim 75 in the 348 patent. So it's number 75 claim, that means there were 74 before it, and there were another 30 or 40 after it. So patents have just claim upon claim upon claim, and they all read like this one. This is one sentence. Okay, let me read it out loud. A transport format combination indicator, TFCI, encoding apparatus in a COMA, that should be CDMA for those of you who know, it was their typo, so I'm just writing it the way they did. Mobile communication system comprising a controller for outputting a 30-bit code word from among a plurality of 30-bit code words that corresponds to a 10-bit TFCI information input to the controller from a plurality of possible 10-bit TFCI information wherein the 30-bit code word output by the controller is equivalent to a 32-bit code word that corresponds to the 10-bit TFCI information input to the controller. That's how lawyers describe what we've been trying to say in mathematical language. That's the legal language that is associated. And again, in the arguments that I was making on invalidity, I had to go word by word and say, where in McWilliams and Sloan does it talk about a controller? Where in McWilliams and Sloan does it say a 30-bit code word that corresponds to blah, blah, blah? Every word of that, I had to have a pointer to one of these. Now, there is one thing that's a little unusual that we haven't mentioned yet. Notice that these are 30-bit strings, not 32-bit strings. What happened with that? Why is that relevant? Well, when you go back to the standards process, and this is just an indication of how messy the standards process, for reasons that are lost in the mists of time, something called the harmonization initiative, the standards body decided they only wanted 30 bits of TFCI information instead of 32 bits. And so all of the claims that are in this patent that deal with 32-bit long, which there are a lot, are irrelevant. Because ultimately, the way that 3G works is with 30-bit code words. How do you get 30-bit code words? You just take out your saw, chop off a couple of bits, there you are. You're down to 30 bits. It's called puncturing. I don't know why it's puncturing instead of chopping, but whatever. It's just easy. You just don't use 2, or you work with that. So, this is a way to doing it in a flowchart. You have 10 bits in, you get 32 bits out. That's what we were talking about before. But if you only want 30, well, you puncture and you get 30 bits out. Okay. That's one way that you could do it. I do want to mention, because this did come up in the trial, a second way that you could do it is you could never have a 32-bit code word. In And here's how you would do it. This is the second order Reed-Muller code that we did, and I would have to tell you which of these I was going to use. I'll just put a box around the first 10 rows, but notice that I chopped off the last 2. And every code word that we would use for the TFCI information would be a combination of the things that are inside the box. So there you don't need a puncture. And again, this becomes relevant in some of the later arguments that have to do with infringement. So this is the second part of the legal argument that, again, is going to involve mathematics, but let's suppose that the judge at the ITC says, yeah, the US Patent Office did their job correctly, so I'm not going to invalidate the patent. There still is this burden of proof on Samsung to say that Apple products are using what's contained in this patent illegally. Okay, so the patent's valid. If that's what the judge rules, we have an infringement idea. A lot of that part of the trial I'm not allowed to talk about. Okay, and in fact, when we entered this part of the trial, anybody that hadn't signed a non-disclosure agreement had to leave the court. So journalists were there, they had to leave, they hadn't signed it, everybody else had to leave. But there was one part, and this is the interesting part where President Obama got involved. Part of the infringement argument didn't have anything to do with what was happening internally in the Apple products. What Samsung said is that just the fact that the Apple products were communicating on 3G meant that they were infringing this patent. You didn't even have to look inside. Just the fact that they could communicate on 3G meant that they were infringing. Now this got a lot of other phone manufacturers' attention, and they really were not happy with this argument. And in fact, the political, and this is a debate not only in the United States but around the world, what do you do about what are called standards essential patents? What's meant by that is, companies might have patents, but the patent might be on something just like this, where in order to communicate on 3G, you have to do what's described in that patent. Should that company still be able to sue and get the same sort of protections that they would for other types of infringements? That's a big debate, political debate. But again, Samsung was making this argument right here. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why that argument doesn't hold water, even if you take away the legal idea. So what I'm showing here is the documentation from the 3G community. Okay, so 3G has all these documents describing how TFCI is going to work, and figure number 9 says TFCI, the way that it's encoded, you have 10 input bits, it goes through this encoder, and what comes out is a TFCI code word that is 32 bits long. Now, if you remember, or you were paying real close attention when we read Claim 75, it said the TFCI code word was 30 bits. The documentation says 32. 32 is not the same as 30. We're done. Okay, that's as simple as that. It's there, that claim. Now, there were other claims that were in dispute, but this was my argument, is 30 is not the same as 32. The documentation says TFCI is 32. Claim 75 says it should be 30. They're different. Okay, so there's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is the documentation from 3G goes on to say that suppose the TFCI information consists of less than 10 bits. So it might be 7 bits or 3 bits. What you do is you pad it out to 10 and then encode that padded out. And by padding, I simply mean add zeros to get the length to be 10 and then encode that. Claim 75 said 10-bit TFCI information. This is saying TFCI information might be less than 10 bits. 10 and less than 10 are not the same. Okay, that's reason number 2. Reason number 3 has to do with going back to this picture. This is what actually shows up in the documentation. This is what Samsung proposed. So we have the whole history of how this argument went in terms of proposals. Samsung wanted the proposal to be TFCI information is 1 to 10 bits, then you get this encoder, then you have a puncturer, and what comes out is a TFCI code word. They lost that argument. Okay, the 3G community, again, we don't know exactly why, but this is the way it's described. TFCI code words are 32 bits. They wanted it to be 30. They lost that argument. Okay, so in court, that's what we were saying is, look, here's how 3G describes this. This is what Claim 75 says. We see a lot of differences. Okay, conclusion slide here. So what was my experience like in this trial? So on April 10th, 2012, from 9:30 in the morning until 6:30 at night, with a 1-hour lunch break, I was sitting at one end of a table with a light and a camera at the other end, filming the entire thing. Samsung lawyers on my right, Apple lawyers on my left, and the Samsung lawyers got to ask me questions about the 1,000 pages of reports that I had written in a 3-month time period. And their purpose was to completely discredit me. Okay? Depositions are not something you would wish on your worst enemy. It's just incredibly nerve-wracking because the technical material wasn't really all that difficult for me, but I wanted to say things in the same ways that I had in the reports, because if there were what they might call an inconsistency, that would definitely come up in court. Okay, because they were going to use this deposition when things went to trial. So for that entire day, I had to be on my game the entire time. Then June 12th, 2012, I was on the witness stand from 8:45 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon. Again, there was a 1-hour lunch break, but part of that was Apple asking me to describe what was in all of my reports. And then Samsung had the opportunity to cross-examine me, and that's where I had that conversation. Where does it say 32? Oh, it says it here, And we had lots of other conversations like that. The ITC had a lawyer that cross-examined me as well. That was a very small part of it. Okay, but that took a long time. Here's the interesting thing about the legal part is, in fact, the initial ruling. So a single judge listened to all the testimony, and that single judge ruled in favor of Apple. So agreed with me, not in quite the way I would have wanted. Okay, I wanted the patent invalidated. That didn't happen. That's very rare that happens, apparently. But the judge agreed that Apple didn't infringe. Okay. Then there's an automatic appeal to a panel of judges. Almost always, that panel of judges agrees with the ruling of the judge. But in this case, that panel of judges overturned that and said, we think that Apple does infringe. And that's where that New Yorker article was saying, ban the iPhones and the iPads at the border. Build a wall. Keep them out. And then President Obama stepped in. Okay, and vetoed, because I don't think President Obama ever saw Corollary 17. I'm not sure, but I doubt that he was interested in the technical details like we are. But again, this is in that political world that President Obama wanted to use this patent as sort of his way of signaling, I want some changes in the way that patent law is being done. And he stepped in and vetoed it. So that's the story, and I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Any questions?
So if communicating on 3G violated Samsung's patent, isn't it Samsung's duty at the point the standardization was done to object at that point?
It is, and that's a really interesting, so you're exactly right that part of the standards process is you are supposed to be transparent about any patent work that you're filing that's related to whatever is being discussed there. They didn't do that. And you can imagine in a standards body that might affect choices that you make if you feel like you're going to get shut out or unfairly penalized because somebody, because you voted a certain way and then it comes back and bites you. So they, again, that was an accusation that the lawyers were making. I wasn't really involved with that fight, but there are sort of responsibilities of participants in standards bodies that they, again, the Apple lawyers would say, and at least from what I know, I would agree that they didn't live up to their responsibilities.
Can you please explain why the first part of the trial wasn't covered by a non-discretion agreement while the second part was?
Yeah, so what happened, the invalidity part was where I was making the argument that this patent, the patent office made a mistake. And there's nothing that you need to look inside an Apple phone, an iPhone, or anything to make that argument. I'm making the case saying McWilliams and Sloan, 1970s, we knew all about these codes. They shouldn't get any protection for that. The infringement part is Samsung saying these iPhones are doing something that's covered by this. Now, I told you one part of it, that communicating on 3G, but a whole other part of that I can't really talk about, but this is what had to happen, is we essentially broke open the iPhones. We didn't literally do that, but we said, what's going on inside when TFCI information is being transmitted? So I had to go to the chip manufacturers. They flew me out. This is crazy. Richmond's on the east coast of the U.S. I flew out for 24 hours to the west coast to visit all these chip manufacturers, and we had to go into special rooms. We had to, have no communications or papers, and they would have somebody there describing what was going on in their chip. And then we went back and we said, oh, okay, that's what's going on in the chip, and here's why it doesn't infringe on that patent. But again, that's proprietary, meaning the companies, the chip manufacturers, don't want the other chip manufacturers to know what's going on in that part of what they're doing. Yeah.
In many standards bodies, people have to declare if there are patents in things they propose, and they have to actually sign something that says that's none. So that would be a problem for Samsung.
That's right. And again, I think that's what that other question was.
And furthermore, many of these makers have cross-licensing, especially for essential patents. So was that defined essential patent? If that is, then they would have cross-licensed each other, wouldn't they?
So yeah, there are all sorts of legal agreements between companies, cross-licensing, because, again, your phone is an unbelievably complicated, and Apple's got patents on what's going on, Nokia has patents, the Qualcomm's, the chip manufacturers, they all have patents on what's going on internally, and so they could, you don't want a situation where everybody is suing everybody else and tying things up. So mostly that stuff is covered by these cross-licensing. But this was a case where apparently this patent was not part of whatever the cross-licensing was between Apple and Samsung had enough and said, we're gonna drop the bomb.
I have another comment. There's a distinction between infringement and trying to strike out a patent. So in this particular case, the Samsung case was saying Apple infringed.
Yes.
So I think it was a case where did you or did you not infringe? Then the validity of patent is a separate exercise. And you actually give power to the person who has the patent, whether the patent is rightly granted or not.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there were two separate phases to this trial, and you don't know the decision on one before, like, you would hope that you could say, oh, invalidated, then I don't even have to worry about infringement, because if it's not really a patent, then why worry about anything? Well, you don't know what the judge is going to rule on that. So you go through the exercise of saying, well, if the judge rules that the patent is valid, then we have to go through this infringement phase as well. Yeah.
Any other question?
Yeah, back.
Your arguments, at least to us, seem quite solid.
They did, and again, so some of the infringement, which is where the judge was changing the ruling of the judge, had to, and in fact the overturn had to do with that closed part of the trial that I can't talk about. So they did actually have reasons in the internal workings. The single judge saw things the way I was describing it, but the panel of judges thought otherwise. Yeah. But again, I can't fill in the details on that. Yeah, sure.
Please explain why 32-bit code words were used initially?
Yeah, so I think probably the best answer to that is that the engineers that started it knew about this first order read Muller code, and it was a comfortable one, so let's just start with that. And once they started with 32 bits as what TFCI information was going to be, they were building the rest of the system kind of around that. And then when they decided, hey, maybe we need something a little different, it was easiest just to stay with length 32. And you're already talking about read Muller codes, so easiest to stay inside second order read Muller, etc. So maybe if they were starting from scratch, they might do something different than that. But it's how the engineers that got things started there, and it's just easiest to stick with things like that. Yeah.
So this trial was quite a while ago, can you tell? So how has the court ruling and Obama's veto changed the scene or the current situation between Apple and Samsung?
Yes, I mean, the Obama ruling was the final word on this particular patent. So in the United States, that court case is done because Obama vetoed the ban. But sort of in the broader picture of what Obama was trying to do, that still is a political issue in the United States. And an interesting one, so probably a lot of you are aware of the internal fightings that are going on in the United States. This one is actually bipartisan, would be a way that we would describe it, meaning it's not as if you could say the Republican position on this is one way and the Democrat position is another way. I think both sides of the aisle are concerned about what is the appropriate way that we should design our patent system so that you do give protection for research and development, so that people that invest a lot of money in research and development can get a payback, but you don't make it so onerous that other competitors can't move in and participate. And it's trying to find that right balance. And again, I think it's an interesting political issue in that it's not. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that part of why Obama was stepping in it hasn't been resolved completely, but it's still going on.
So if Samsung's code have to do with corollary 17 of the book, how about Apple's code? Did it also not involve this corollary 17?
Well, it did. So if you're going to communicate on 3G, the code that's described in the 348 patent is the code that you have to use. So they have, here are, all one code word, and 01010101, and 80s, 81s, 80s, 81s. There's the code, and if you're communicating on 3G, it's that specific code that you're using.
So in that case, why did Apple just point to that corollary and say, this is what we use, it's already in the book, and then case closed?
That's kind of the argument that I was trying to make in court, is that the code that is described in the 348, and the difficulty there, and this is how, as a mathematician walks into a courtroom, okay, it sounds like a joke, but as a mathematician walks into a courtroom, it's not precisely the code that's in corollary 17. You have to permute the columns. So it's an equivalent code to the one that's in corollary 17. But how do you describe that to a judge who hasn't taken mathematics for 35 or 40 years? I mean, and part of what I did at the trial, so in preparation for it, I was sitting in a witness box and answering questions, and it just felt very awkward. And so the lawyers for Apple said, we need to get you out of the courtroom, or out of the witness box. So for the parts where I was trying to teach the judge, I got permission to leave the witness box and to come over and sort of do my teaching where I was circling things, and it was so much more comfortable than sort of feeling like I was in a straitjacket in a witness box. And I don't know whether it was effective for the judge, but it certainly felt a lot more comfortable for me in terms of explaining.
I get it. It got him very much confused.
Yeah, but he was, it was interesting to watch. He was really trying hard to follow. So I give him a lot of credit for that. There was a hand in the back.
What would have been the value of infringement at Apple loss?
So when Apple did lose, that was that quote from the New Yorker magazine. At the ITC, the only punishment that they can give is preventing importing of products. So it would have stopped importing iPhones, iPads, and any other devices from Apple that were ruled to infringe. They were, even though that court process was very fast by legal standards, it took a year, but as quickly as technology moves on, those phones were pretty dated by that point, and we were already on to the next generation. So the actual effect wasn't going to be horrific, but it was more the sort of political effect of, oh, no more iPads coming in. So.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
So has the way in which telco companies or phone producers approach 3D networking and the technological development of the phones changed in light of these patent cases, or have they still been following the same?
I think they're somewhat, strange bedfellows might be an expression, or where they're forced to work together. When you go to 4G, you still have that same issue of, I have an iPhone, you have a Galaxy, I want those to be able to talk to each other. If I want to send a streaming video or pictures or whatever. So they have to work in these standards bodies, and then you get all these issues where there are rules that aren't being followed in those standards processes, and who do you trust, and but they don't really have a choice but to work through this.
Guess they have to go to Corollary 18 this time.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, any more questions?
There's one in the back.
So has the patent 3.8 been eventually revoked, or?
It hasn't. No, it was, at least in that court. Again, there would be other courts that could make other rulings, but the judge did not invalidate, I think is the way that you should say it, meaning the judge said, I don't see any reason to say that the U.S. Patent Office was wrong. So I'm just going to let it stay as the 348 patent. Yeah.
Can you also comment that Obama did not overturn the ITC judgment that Apple brought against Samsung, not 6 months later, for infringing on scrolling and other...
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know those details as well, but I think you're right. He intervened again, and for the same reason, meaning standards essential patents. But again, I'm not as familiar with that as this one.
Okay. Well, I have simply read about the legal suits that went on between Apple and Samsung, but I never knew that there was something mathematical behind this legal suit. So it's a very interesting talk, enlightening, certainly to me, I'm sure to the audience as well, that behind many of these modern technologies and that have legal implications, that mathematics actually played a major role in making all these suits, well, settling, I guess, the suits and so on. But to us mathematicians, it's good to know that mathematics is really coming alive in modern industry, and it's really impossible for even a judge to be ignorant of mathematics and to decide on the case intelligently and hopefully correctly.
Yeah.
So please join me in thanking Professor Davis for showing this talk. And I'd like to present a token of appreciation souvenir to Professor Davis. This is a coffee mug. This is IMS coffee mug. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Good night.